Hi everybody, welcome to a special post-State of the Union episode of This Week in Immigration. I'm Jordan Lapierre, BPC's press secretary, and I'm joined this week by Theresa Cardinal-Brown. She's Director of Immigration and Cross-Border Policy here at BPC, and Michele Stockwell, Executive Director of BPC Action. Hi to both of you.
Hi.
We have a lot to talk about, so we're going to jump right into this. As expected, last night, President Trump dedicated a large portion of his address to immigration. So let's start with the broad strokes. Was there anything notable for either of you in how he approached the issue?
I think he stuck very closely to a lot of the talking points he has had about immigration, particularly over the last month or so. He has definitely focused a lot of his attention on the immigration debate, one on the status of the Dreamers, but also on the issues of chain migration and the diversity lottery. He has focused a lot about safety and security of Americans. So I think it was very, very much of a line. I didn't hear a lot of deviation from the talking points he's been using.
I think that's accurate too. I think it was a lot of what we've already been hearing and certainly what we expected to hear out of him. I think there was definitely a very strong focus on interior enforcement and criminalization, which obviously struck a chord among a lot of the Democrats in the audience in a negative way. But it was certainly not a surprising speech from him on that standpoint.
There was one line in the president's remarks, or one paragraph in the president's remarks, that got a lot of attention. So let's play a little bit of that sound here.
So tonight, I am extending an open hand to work with members of both parties, Democrats and Republicans, to protect our citizens of every background, color, religion, and creed. And the sacred duty of every elected official in this chamber is to defend Americans, to protect their safety, their families, their communities, and their right to the American dream. Because Americans are dreamers too.
Americans are dreamers too. Is that rhetoric going to bring Democrats to the table?
Well, I think you heard in the room a lot of words, and there was a lot of dreamers in the audience. A lot of Democrats had brought them as well. And I think one of the reasons that got such a strong negative reaction is that he basically, the strong inference from that is that Dreamers, and by extension other immigrants, can be a threat to Americans' safety and security. So the implication is literally pitting Americans against immigrants. And I think that framing is one that Democrats have not supported and liked. They feel like it has caused a lot of difficulty in immigrant communities, a lot of sort of more extreme responses toward immigrants. And I think that caused some consternation there.
I'd agree with that. I think it's we've seen this in other cases, the president of making comments about wanting this process to be bipartisan, but then throwing in a line that really kind of gets the goat of the other side and really kind of stirs it up a bit.
That having been said, I mean, he has made no bones about his presidency being an America first, Americans first presidency. Right. And so it was right along the lines, as I said, with the rhetoric he has used. But it is not, I mean, when we talk about immigration, one of the issues around the immigration debate is that the rhetoric that has been used on both sides has become increasingly polarized. And I think that statement did nothing to sort of bridge that gap.
The president also returned last night to the 4 pillars that he sketched out for an immigration deal, and those came out of that televised meeting on DACA a few weeks ago, and we think they continue to kind of be the scope of the negotiations, the 4 items on the table. So let's go through those pillars one by one. Here's the first one.
The first pillar of our framework generously offers a path to citizenship for 1.8 million illegal immigrants who were brought here by their parents at a young age. That covers almost 3 times more people than the previous administration covered. Under our plan, those who meet education and work requirements and show good moral character will be able to become full citizens of the United States over a 12-year period.
A lot to unpack there. First, where is that 1.8 million number coming from?
Well, before we get to that, I want to go back to the rhetoric position because he referred to a path to citizenship for illegal immigrants. That term, illegal immigrants, is one of those what I would call weaponized terms in the immigration debate.
Yeah.
Immigrant advocates do not like that term. They believe that people should not be referred to as illegal, but it is the preferred term of immigration restrictionists. And so just by using that term, again, it fired off on some of those cylinders.
I think it's a good point about some of the kind of
how he frames everything,
language.
The coded language. So even when he's planning to, he's offering an olive branch of, look, I'm giving citizenship to these people, he's using language that they themselves reject. So that's important to understand in reviewing this. The 1.8 million is along the lines of the estimate of those who would have been eligible for DACA but may not have filed in time. It's close to the numbers that might be eligible under, for example, the DREAM Act that was introduced by Senators Durbin and Graham. Similar in line to where some of the other legislation, we don't know exactly where he got this number, but it's not out of bounds from some of the other estimates that we've seen of the bills that have been introduced.
The president also has put some conditions on citizenship. He mentions work requirements, education requirements, and good moral character. What does he mean by those?
Well, again, we don't have details of his proposal, but if we're trying to infer what he's meaning from existing pieces of legislation, almost all of the legislation would require those who qualify for this legalized status to have a job, to go to school, to stay out of trouble and not commit crimes. The good moral character piece, that's an actual term of art in the immigration law. It is normally attached to requirements for citizenship. In order to naturalize in this country, you have to show that you are of good moral character. In practice, what that means is that certain misdemeanor crimes may not be deportable, may not get you kicked out of the country, but if they impugn your moral character, so things like financial fraud, for example, could be considered to mean that you don't have good moral character and are not eligible for citizenship. So again, we don't know exactly what he means, but that particular term is well known to immigration experts and has a long, actually, judicial history of what it can be interpreted as.
I think there was an expectation going into the speech that there would be a little bit more clarity around the president's proposal. I don't think we really heard that last night. It was still a lot of just broader talking points. There has been a summary of the president's proposal that's been out there now for a couple of days.
Right.
And I don't think he did a lot to answer some of the unknown questions around that proposal.
Yeah, there wasn't any expansion of what we'd seen previously.
So I also want to talk for a second about the results from the focus group that BPC conducted last night with some Obama-Trump voters and Romney-Clinton voters. On the whole, the Obama-Trump voters were pretty supportive of the president's plan, while the Romney-Clinton voters that we talked with were not. So that's, in and of itself, that's not really surprising.
Yeah.
But on this first pillar, some of the Obama-Trump voters who opposed it were really in opposition with each other about that 12-year time frame. Some felt that it was too short a period of time, while some felt that that was way too long. What are your reactions to that conversation, Theresa? You were there.
I was there, and I saw that. That was very interesting to me, that there was divisions even within those who voted for Trump about what the right answer for these people should be. And I think it's reflective somewhat of the divisions in the country as a whole. Particularly among Republicans, I think there's not a broad... I would say no, there is a broad consensus. The majority of Americans, including majorities of Republicans and Democrats, do want to see these folks legalized. But within that, there are still some that prefer no amnesty, as they call it, whatsoever. And the interesting thing was that one person said, well, 12 years is an awful long time to wait. Why should they have to wait so long? And the next person said, I don't think they should have citizenship at all. So that just, I think, is emblematic of the tightrope that Republicans, and particularly this president, is trying to walk in putting out a deal that might get Democratic support, which he needs to pass the Senate and probably the House, while maintaining the support of those who voted for him, of his base. And that's a difficult thing when you have such diametrically opposed viewpoints on something like this.
Let's ask, though, the 12-year number was kind of a sticking point for this group. How does that stack up with some of the other proposals that have been on the table in Congress? Are they offering citizenship over a shorter time frame, a longer time frame? How do these compare?
It's in line with some of the proposals. I think 12 years is about the longest that any of the bills have had. One of the Republican bills in the Senate, the Succeed Act, was 12 years. The proposal that we understood was presented to the president from Senators Durbin and Graham and Gardner and others in that working group,
right.
Would have had a 12-year path to citizenship, but 10 years if people had already had DACA. So it may be based on that. Again, no more details than we've seen before, but it's not, I would say, completely out of line. It's on the upper end of what's been introduced, but it's within the realm of what's been talked about already.
Let's move on to the second pillar.
Second pillar fully secures the border. That means building a great wall on the southern border, and it means hiring more heroes like CJ to keep our communities safe. Crucially, our plan closes the terrible loopholes exploited by criminals and terrorists to enter our country, and it finally ends the horrible and dangerous practice of catch and release.
So we here at BPC have called for a more expansive view of border security beyond a wall, and the president seems to be echoing that kind of thinking here. So beyond physical borders, what kind of border security investments should we be talking about in these negotiations? What should be on the table?
Well, one of the things I have noticed is a slight shift in the rhetoric out of the White House. They now talk about a border wall system. So they are, explicitly acknowledging that it's more than just a wall. And I think it's including additional things like fences and technology, personnel. But I think more explicitly here, and this has been part of the conversations that, for example, the Homeland Security Secretary has been having when she's on the Hill. They are now making claims that border security also includes elements of interior enforcement. And so that may be what he's referring to. He mentioned CJ, who is the Immigration Customs Enforcement agent that he highlighted during the speech, who had gone after MS-13 gang members in Long Island. That is interior enforcement. So I think that there's sort of been a melding, if you will, of all of these terms under the rubric of border security. And again, until we sort of see a more detailed proposal from the president, but I think we can expect definitely there'll be some wall, definitely other physical border barriers, but I think also we're looking at changes to how they conduct enforcement in the interior of the country as well.
And is that, when he talks about loopholes, is that what we're talking about, some of the interior enforcement priorities and procedures, policies?
Yeah, I mean, the one thing I will say is that loopholes are always in the eye of the beholder. It doesn't matter what law you're talking about, whether it's tax law or somebody else. One person's loophole is another person's, provision of discretion, or however you want to call it. Inferring from other things that he and folks in his administration have said and where the debate has been, I believe that he was referring to the law that addresses how people apprehended at the border are treated if they're not from Mexico. So we have a couple of things here. If you're from Mexico, we can usually return you right across the border pretty quickly because you're a Mexican national and Mexico has to take their nationals back. That's international law. But if you come through Mexico but are from El Salvador, Honduras, or Guatemala, or Haiti, or Africa, or anywhere else, Mexico doesn't have to take you back just because you entered from there. And so the process usually means that they have to be apprehended, processed in the interior. They may be detained while they are put into deportation proceedings, or they might be, if there's not enough detention space, released to await a removal hearing. That's the process of catch and release that he's talking about. And this administration believes that basically everyone should be detained until they can go through an immigration court hearing. For those who arrive as children, the unaccompanied minors, there's a particular provision that comes out of a Trafficking Prevention Act. Again, the United States has always had concern about children being trafficked across the border for labor trafficking or sex trafficking or any other kind of trafficking. And so in order to protect victims of trafficking, there are additional protections that apply, including the ability of them to have a hearing before an immigration judge to make claims of being victim or asylum claims and things like that, especially if they come from countries that are not contiguous, Mexico or Canada. And so that provision has been criticized by this administration and by some Republicans under the previous administration for allowing minors to, again, be released into the country, may or may not show up for immigration hearings and things like that. So those are the debate that's been going around. So when he talks about loopholes, that is possibly what he's talking about there. It would be consistent with where his administration has been.
I want to go back to what our focus group last night said, because, again, this was sort of interesting. Both groups, both the Obama-Trump voters and the Romney-Clinton voters, disliked this part of the president's proposal. Does that surprise either of you?
I mean, I think that, believe it or not, the wall is not that popular. When I was watching the focus group, when he started talking about the wall, that's when the numbers started dipping. Yeah. And I believe that there was a little bit of conversation about that afterwards with some of the focus group participants. And they were like, look, he promised us that Mexico was going to pay for the wall, and now he's asking for $25 billion to pay for a wall, and now we're paying for the wall. So this isn't what he promised, and he's not doing what he promised. So I think in some ways, maybe the wall that was his sort of signature campaign promise has become a little bit of a problematic thing for him because of the way it's being caught up in appropriations.
I think, the voters in the election, I think most people always took that as kind of symbolic comment, and that most people really grasped the fact that they were not going to construct a physical barrier across the whole southern border. And most people saw it as kind of a stand-in code for a more secure system. Yeah.
Let's take a look at the third pillar.
The third pillar ends the visa lottery, a program that randomly hands out green cards without any regard for skill, merit, or the safety of American people. Time to begin moving toward a merit-based immigration system, one that admits people who are skilled, who want to work, who will contribute to our society, and who will love and respect our country.
Do you think that's a fair characterization of the visa lottery system?
I'll be honest, I want desperately to just parse that sentence because
let's do it.
Because there's so many. First of all, this is the least developed of the proposal that the White House put out. There's like 2 sentences on it, and it's basically what he said here. So we don't know what he means by a merit-based system. We don't know what that looks like or how many visas that would be. We don't have any detail on what any of these things are. But going back to that coded messaging I talked about earlier on, there's a lot of it in this sentence. First of all, we talk about the visa lottery, and that term in and of itself has been used to describe this program, the diversity visa category, pretty much since it was instituted. And it is technically a lottery in that individuals each year, when the lottery window opens, are allowed to file an application if they are from one of the countries that are allowed, and literally the winners are picked at random by the State Department. So that much is true. It is a lottery. However, it is not necessarily true to say that it hands out green cards without any regard for skill, merit, or the safety of our people. I think that is a very incorrect characterization. In order to apply, I mean, even if you enter the lottery and say you're selected, in order to actually get a green card, you do have to show that you have some skills. You have to have a high school degree or 2 years of work experience. You have to meet all of the other criteria to be admitted to the United States. What are those criteria? Well, you have to show that you can earn a living. You're not going to become a public charge. You have to show that you don't have any health issues. You have to show that you're not a criminal. You have to show that you have no terrorist ties. You have to show that you have not previously committed immigration violations. So all of those things apply equally to those who are selected in the visa lottery, to those who are selected as a person of extraordinary ability who's won a Nobel Prize. They all have to meet all of those criteria. So it's not true to say that they're admitted without regard to merit or the safety of the U.S. public. So I think that's disingenuous. Then he talks about beginning to move to a merit-based immigration system. This term merit-based gets a lot of high scores because it sounds really good. Of course we want people of merit, but we don't define what merit means. What do you mean? Are you really thinking you only want to invite all the Nobel Prize winners in the world? Well, there are an awful lot of people who support our economy and have jobs in our economy that may not be Nobel Prize winners, but could become that. I mean, if you look at half the Fortune 500 were immigrants founded by immigrants or children of immigrants, right? A lot of Silicon Valley came from that. They may not have had that Nobel Prize when they came, but look where they are now. Half of the patents found in the United States are foreign-born scientists and engineers, right? So that's a level of skill. But even if you look at the other end of the spectrum, agriculture is in desperate need of people to help get our food on the table. We have manufacturing that's looking for more people who have skills to do these manufacturing jobs. Yes, we need to train all of our own workers, but that may not be enough because our own workforce is aging and shrinking. So how do we define merit, and what is that going to look like? And I think that's sort of the most undeveloped part of this proposal, and really needs to be fleshed out a lot more before people can understand what he's looking to do there.
I think people are really, when you look at the voters, I think this term is a very interesting term. It's only going to grow, I think, as we look at as this debate unfolds over the coming years. It really is, I think, where people are now kind of turning to hang their hats. If we only had a merit-based system, things would be so much better. But it is very, as Theresa's laid out, completely undefined. And I think this is the term that really gets at, the inconsistencies about how people look at immigration. As on the one hand, those who are opposed to it having this general anxiety about immigrants taking away jobs that they otherwise would have, but yet at the same time wanting a system that is bringing in more skilled people. And that kind of inherent inconsistency, I think, is kind of interesting to see how the public is looking at this issue and how they will continue to process this over the next years.
One of the other things that has been more explicitly sort of made clear by this president and others is sort of contrasting this idea of a merit-based system against a family-based system. Now, if you look at our current immigration system, the majority of immigrant visas issued each year are issued to people who have family members already here. Mm-hmm. And so there has been a debate over many years about whether or not we should balance our immigration system a little differently. Should we promote more people who are coming for economic purposes? That's not to say that people who come as family-sponsored don't also contribute to our economy. As a matter of fact, recent research shows that those who come on family visas, their education level has been going up over the last several years, and including immigrants from places like Africa and Asia tend to have higher levels of education than the average in the United States. So it's not necessarily true that just because you come based on a family member, you wouldn't otherwise be skilled or have merit. So again, a lot of details to be figured out on here. It's probably a much bigger conversation that this country needs to have than necessarily putting it in this particular frame.
I'll just stop here to note that for a lot of the reasons that you discussed, no surprise, the Obama-Trump voters on our panel last night responded really positively to this call for a merit-based system, and there was a wide discrepancy between their feelings on this issue and where the Romney-Clinton voters were, and we'll talk about that a little bit more after the fourth pillar.
The fourth and final pillar protects the nuclear family by ending chain migration. Under the current broken system, a single immigrant can bring in virtually unlimited numbers of distant relatives. Under our plan, we focus on the immediate family by limiting sponsorships to spouses and minor children. This vital reform is necessary not just for our economy, but for our security and for the future of America.
So you could hear the audience react a little bit to some of what he was saying there. What were they reacting to?
Okay, again, coded terminology. Chain migration has become a pejorative term that has applied to family-sponsored migration, which again has been part and parcel of our immigration system since the beginning, but especially since 1965. And so again, just the use of that term got a lot of people who react negatively to that term to react negatively to that term. Again, sort of saying that a single immigrant can bring in virtually unlimited numbers of distant relatives, that is an exaggeration in the extreme. Our current immigration system allows U.S. citizens to sponsor their spouse and minor children, which he believes is fine, their parents, so their children's grandparents, their adult children, and their spouses and kids, and their brothers and sisters and their spouses and kids. So at most, you could get to a nephew and niece in this. So it's not distant relatives. It's not your second cousin twice removed. It's not your sister-in-law's mother-in-law's daughter. It doesn't work that way. So that's an exaggeration. The other thing is that he's talking about the immediate family, and it talks about the nuclear family. But he in his proposal apparently would omit the adult children of U.S. citizens. So I have a 22-year-old daughter and an 18-year-old son that would not be considered my immediate family under his proposal. Even though they both live with me still, hopefully not forever, but still. And increasingly in the United States, our older children are still part of our immediate family. And even if they move out, they're still part of my immediate family. So to say to a U.S. citizen that if my daughter or son happened to be overseas, I could not bring them here to live with me, that would be a question. So I think there are things to parse out among this proposal. But more so, this is, saying that family-based immigration is inherently somehow worse or awful than employment-based immigration. And that, again, is an area for debate in this country about balance. But he also says that it is not good for our security. Again, there's no evidence whatsoever that people come in family-based visas are any more of a security risk than people who come as refugees, asylees, employment-based immigrants, because they all are screened the same way. So that's sort of an open question as well.
Keeping all of that in mind, do you think there is room for compromise on this point? Are there changes that could be made?
I think there is room for compromise. Part of what is a struggle for members of Congress, frankly, on both sides of the aisle, for both this issue of the, quote unquote, chain migration and then the diversity visas, is what do we want our legal immigration system to look like? And what do we want those numbers to be? Both of these issues feed into that. And I think that's where there is a lot of concern about, cuts to our overall legal immigration. What should be the genesis for our immigration system? Should it be family-based? Should it be merit-based? I think there are still differences across the aisle on what those should fundamentally look like. I think, as we saw in the Graham-Durbin proposal, there was certainly some movement among the Democrats on this issue. So I do think that there is a willingness to examine this and look at some possible compromises.
So one of the things I would also mention is that it is true that in past comprehensive immigration legislation that had been introduced, including the 2013 bill that passed the Senate, it would have reduced some categories of family immigration. It also would have eliminated the diversity lottery. It would have reallocated those visas to some new categories in employment-based system. It was also in the context of a much bigger bill that also would legalize almost all of the undocumented in the United States.
Right.
So one of the issues here in terms of compromise is not necessarily whether there's compromise on this particular portion or these particular portions, but can there be compromise in the context of what is a much smaller package that the president is trying to put forward, basically looking at legalization and citizenship for 1.8 million dreamers, for significant changes to our legal immigration system, absent conversations about, for example, the rest of the immigration system, and the undocumented.
And we've talked about this issue before, of this, as Congress is trying to struggle with the, both sides of the aisle, trying to figure out what's the right proportionality in this deal. What is the right trade-off for a pathway to citizenship for the DACA recipients and the Dreamer population? What does that trade-off look like, and how do they figure out the right proportional balance on that?
Yeah. And right now, I think there's some differences in how the Republicans see it versus how the Democrats see it, maybe how the president sees it.
And likewise, there were big differences, again, on this point between our Obama-Trump voters and our Romney-Clinton voters. Probably no surprise. They were, in terms of approval, about 50 points apart in how they viewed this proposal from the president. You, Theresa, hinted at this a little bit before, but I want to draw this out a little bit more. How much do you think the polarization that we saw on our panel last night on some of these issues reflects the political difficulty of reaching a deal with all four of these elements included? Is that just a preview of what, or sort of a sample of what's going on in Congress right now?
I think that's part of it. I would also say that it reflects the difficulty in trying to negotiate complex policy issues through short sound bites. A lot of the negative reaction or positive reaction came to the term chain migration. Again, we go back. Those terminologies have taken on 180-degree diametrically opposed connotations for people on either side of the immigration debate. On one side, the term is anathema. On the other side, it is the preferred term. The same with the term illegal immigrant or amnesty. There are a lot of those really charged terms in this debate in the rhetoric around immigration. And I think we focus so much on that terminology that it's hard to get past it sometimes to actually look at the policies. I think if we were to talk about the policies, you might be able to get people in a room reasonably to come to some sort of agreement or consensus. But it's hard sometimes because we have become so triggered, for want of a better word, in one way or another, to some of these terms to get beyond that to actually talk about policies.
So all this having been said, where do we find ourselves today after the speech as opposed to yesterday before it? Are we closer to a deal or farther away? Or did the speech not matter?
I don't think the speech, in the grand scheme of things, changed where we are with regard to Congress reaching a deal on this. You know, it helped clarify that there is now a framework on the table that now Congress is going to have to respond to, and they are in that process of figuring out, you know, what does that path forward look like. I think we still expect Mitch McConnell to bring a bill to the floor. It looks like now it's going to be the president's proposal. And the question becomes, you know, whether or not this group of 30, the Common Sense Caucus, can reach a bipartisan deal or help the Senate reach a bipartisan deal that would allow the Senate to produce something that would get 60 votes. I think that's still very much up in the air. Obviously, we're getting ever closer to the March 5th deadline. And whether or not they can get there still remains to be seen. As we've talked about, there's a lot of still unknowns around what does each side understand these issues to mean and what do definitions look like. But I think there's also still a strong desire to want to try to address this issue and deal with it.
Yeah. I think the other thing to bear in mind is that the dynamics in the Senate and the dynamics in the House are still somewhat different. And even if the Senate can come to something that they can pass on the floor that results in some sort of compromise, it's unclear that that would be able to pass the much more polarized House.
Yeah.
And frankly, at that point, that's when the president's leadership would become probably most important. How badly does he want a deal? How badly does he want to sign something that provides protection for the dreamers that he says he has wanted all along? Because then it would probably become incumbent on him to try to see how he can get the House on board with something. So we'll see how this all plays out.
And his position is critical then to the House reaching agreement, because the House, much more than the Senate, I think has always thought that's where you need the cover from the president and taking a stand. And I think that's where the president coming out and saying this is a deal around pathway to citizenship for the 1.8, I think is a significant element of this debate.
So if you're saying to watch one thing, it's how strongly does the president advocate for this deal in the coming weeks as an indication of whether this moves forward or not?
I think that will be a good indication. Obviously, as we've talked about, there needs to be a lot more clarity around these and whether or not he now is just going to step back and let Congress see if they can figure that out, or do they step forward and try to help some more clarity in this?
Well, I want to thank you both for joining me to unpack the speech a little bit. It was obviously a remarkable speech and a lot to discuss. I want to thank you for a great conversation.
Thank you, Jordan.
And thanks to you for listening. As always, you can follow us on Twitter. We're at BPC_bipartisan. You can find us on Facebook by searching Bipartisan Policy Center. And be sure to subscribe to all of our podcasts wherever you like to get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.